Welcome back, everybody. On the Do Now, I was hoping you could explain um, how big of a problem you think racism is in America. Now, this is going to be your perspective, your opinion. Hopefully, you had some examples of things that make you think that racism is a big problem, medium problem, small problem. I ask you this question because we're going to kind of shift gears. We're still talking about the 1950s, but instead of talking about the Cold War, we're going to start talking about issues around racism and civil rights. So during this time period, the Cold War era, America's fighting the Cold War, but they're also having issues when it comes to racism and civil rights. So we're still talking about the same time period, still the 1950s, we're just changing our focus. So we're going to be looking at some examples of racism and discrimination in America, and we'll be doing this on and off throughout the rest of the trimester. Just as a reference, some of these primary sources are going to depict some terrible things. Racism is a terrible thing, and we need to confront it and see it and recognize it for what it is. I'm not going to show you the worst images I can find, but I'm showing you real images, real pictures from a time when our country was much, much worse than today. Also, some of the language that was used back then is not language we use today. So you might see it, you might hear it in a video. We understand that this is not the way we act or think today, and I'll ask that you refrain from using that language. But I understand that it's uncomfortable to see. As always, just ask you to be respectful in what we're doing. We're going to start with talking about something called Jim Crow laws. These are a collection of different types of laws that were passed in the United States from the end of the Civil War through the 1960s, so 100 years. These are racist laws meant to oppress African Americans and other minorities, people of Hispanic descent, people of Arabic descent, people of Asian descent. These Jim Crow laws all attacked them, although it was most specifically against African Americans. They were the biggest group and the group that was being targeted the most. They're called Jim Crow laws because there was a cartoon character called Jim Crow, who was an African American who was depicted in a very negative way. And the nickname became synonymous with negative things about African Americans, and then it was attached to these types of laws. The way these laws worked is that they tended to be small laws. It wasn't like the whole country was doing them. It tended to be in towns and states, and they specifically set out laws to hurt African Americans. Now, they came in basically two major categories. The first was restricting voting rights. So there's a lot of laws that made it almost impossible for African Americans to vote, even though we had a constitutional amendment that said all races are allowed to vote. States and local communities came up with ways to get around to that and to force African Americans out of the polling booth, out of the ability to vote. And when you lose your right to vote, you lose your voice. Really hard to change anything or make laws that make equality better when you don't even have the right to vote. The other way Jim Crow laws affected people was something called segregation. Segregation means to separate. When we talk about it here in the United States, we're talking about how people of different races were separated. Different bathrooms, different schools, different sides of the bus, whatever it is, based on your race. These are the two major categories of Jim Crow laws, and you can see how negative and harmful they are. Here's some examples of those Jim Crow laws: different drinking fountains, areas for voting, right? Persecuting any African American who's trying to vote. Only whites allowed in this community. White only swimming pools. Right? These are all examples of segregation. On top of that, there's large amounts of violence. African Americans would be attacked, beaten in the streets, sometimes murdered, and no justice. There'd be no justice involved. And a lot of times when things were the other way around and the African American attacked or was committed a crime against white, they were excessively punished. Lynching is a terrible thing. This is when someone gets killed and hanged. This was a punishment used for African Americans, often without the justice system involved. So the community would decide that someone was guilty, whether they were or not, and they would kill, it was usually young men, and hang them in the streets for everyone to see. There were groups like the KKK, which stands for Ku Klux Klan, which were essentially terrorist groups of white supremacists who'd go around and attack and hurt African Americans, threaten them, kill them. Anytime an African American took a step towards equality or to improve their lives, the KKK would attack and terrorize them. And while all of those were huge, huge problems, the vast majority of white Americans weren't directly involved in that stuff. What they were involved in was neglect and apathy. They purposely ignored what was going on. They did not want to see what was going on with African Americans. They ignored the racism and they were apathetic. They didn't care. They didn't choose to try and help. They chose to look the other way and pretend it wasn't happening. All right, so the majority of Americans could have changed this. They chose not to. Here's some examples of the KKK. They would wear robes. They had a bunch of weird symbols. It was almost like a cult in a lot of ways. I'm not sure what all the symbols mean, but they would burn crosses. That was a threat to certain people. And like I said, they were very violent. Here's a picture of lynching. The whole community came out to watch, and you can see the victim's feet hanging in the picture. We got a video we're going to watch about Jim Crow laws. And today's goal is to understand cause and effect. We're going to make a cause and effect diagram like I draw on the board. After reading, you're going to create this and explain why these laws happened and how they impacted people.